Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. This is a bit freaking terrifying, I can tell you. Thank you so much for coming along today, and I'm sure there's a few hungover folks, so double thank you to you guys. Today I brought some really interesting artifacts from our past, and they really resonate with me as someone who worked in IT and cyber for about 13 years. And I just want to give you a little bit of context about what this stuff is and where it's coming from and why I'm kind of building this collection, this mad idea of a museum. When I first started talking about this idea, I called it a cyber espionage museum. And my son eventually convinced me that that was the most crap name in the world for a museum. And no normal person would ever understand what that meant. But the three words were meaningful to me: cyber plus espionage plus museum. The cyber speaks to our heritage as nerds. It struck me, I was at a conference about a dozen years ago, and it struck me while I was sitting in that audience of normal people, people who are in the power generation and distribution industry, that trying to talk to those folks about cyber, intangible and ephemeral threats, and the concept of threat actors, the idea that there are people who wake up every day on the other side of the world and their job is to take us down, that's not an easy conversation to have with a lot of normal folks, right? They don't grow up in an adversarial mindset kind of culture. And it occurred to me that if we could go back in time and collect the timeline of articles that show how the threat actors eventually evolved into digital, right, that would be a useful thing, that we could literally take the concepts of cyber and render them as physical objects, and people would find that easier to relate to. So that was where that piece came from. The second piece was thinking about me and my peers and how, you guys do the important work of protecting every other industry, right? Government, utilities, retail, transport, all that stuff is protected by cyber. And so many of these other industries that we protect have libraries, they have museums, they have cultural centres, and there are people archiving their history. And it struck me as kind of wrong that, there's the odd crazy person out there like Lizard Boy with his 8-bit computer collection, but, there's not really a lot of cyber heritage out there, and we will lose it very, very quickly. And so the idea was to build something that for our community represented our culture. It's very much a bootstrap thing. There is no government funding happening here. I don't have any grants. I don't have any sponsors. It's literally just one, frankly, fucking madman's idea to build something that resonates with our people and then tells our story and then helps us to communicate to the wider community through analogies. Yeah, that's kind of what it's about. Now, in saying that, I also believe that a spy museum can be a viable concern. And my intention is to try and get something up and running in Sydney, and I'm trying to figure out now, okay, I've got this mountain of equipment, how do I bootstrap it into a physical place? And the biggest thing that you could do to help me today is follow me on one of those accounts. There's an Australian Spy Museum account on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, whatever rocks your boat. That helps me tremendously. I would love to leave here today with hundreds more followers. That'd be freaking awesome. So, let's start. I have a little clicker in my pocket here. Maybe it's just glad to see me. So the collection consists of 7 domains. I know there's only 6, I'll get to that. So we start with cultural artifacts. So that's your propaganda posters and all those kind of things. And books on cryptography going back to 1571. So Trithemius, Gaspar Schott, those kinds of people who were really fundamental for describing kind of modern, more advanced cryptography. Cold War is a huge collection of stuff, including the actual technology off the Berlin Wall, right? The cameras, the searchlights, the alarms, all those kind of fun things. Plus the stuff that talks about the mentality of our adversary and all of those famous spy cases from that time. Tradecraft is all the bits and pieces that you expect to see when you think get smart. It's the recorders, the bugs, the countermeasures equipment, hundreds of spy cameras, yada yada, all that sort of stuff. And toolkits, covert entry, forensics, that sort of stuff. Covert communications is a whole bunch of spy radios plus what's called burst encoders. The most insane Stasi equipment you've ever seen for voice over infrared beams. Just mad things like that. Cryptography, of course, we have a small part of the cryptography collection. There's a lot more systems than this. And then what I call birth of cyber, right? And that's literally the point where we pivot over from kind of purpose-specific, almost calculating equipment in the 40s into general-purpose computing. And then the seventh dimension is what I call modern threats. And modern threats is all the stuff that preoccupies organisations like the SIS and ASIO today. Now, prior to Enigma, let's just set the scene to understand how radical an innovation this is. Prior to Enigma, you had a number of really quite simple manual devices. And in general, they're wheels or discs, like the one at the top there. That happens to be a French one. And believe it or not, the US used something very similar to that during the Civil War, and they only rotated the keys 4 times. Incredible. No wonder the Confederates got owned again and again. And then when the US went into World War I, there's a little disc printed on celluloid, the US Army signal disc. It was no more advanced than that, just 2 alphabets, monoalphabetic substitution. Bottom left, Joseph Mowbourne, who invented the concept of the one-time pad, came up with this idea for an M94 cipher device. And the M94 is 25 discs on a central spindle. Each one has the alphabet in a different order. And you can set a piece of clear text on there and read any other line of text around the circumference of that cylinder, and then you transmit that, maybe even via pigeon back in World War I. That was pretty common, right? They get it at the other end, and then when they set their device to be able to read that, then the clear text appears on another row on the cylinder. That was a pretty cool idea. And of course, the key consists of which order you put those discs on the spindle. Pretty simple, rugged, field cipher. The French, meanwhile, being the classiest people in the world, came up with a device called the Lugan Sphinx. And you'll often see the Sphinx motif repeated in cryptography because the French broke the Rosetta Stone, right, Champollion, decrypted the hieroglyphics in about 1820, and there was this explosion of interest in cryptography in France. So there's a large focus in our collection on 19th century French crypto, where it got really interesting. So this is the Lugan Sphinx, and the key material consists of which order I insert those 20 rods in that machine. And by twiddling the knobs on the side of it, I can push those rods up or down relative to each other to slide the 2 alphabets. And I read the clear text across the top bar and the cipher text across the bottom. That's a neat little telegraphic cipher device. So this brings us up to the 1920s. And in World War I, 3 people almost simultaneously had the same idea to apply electricity to cryptography. So the concept of rotating alphabets on disks was already understood. And if you know anything about kind of devices in the 19th century, you might have seen electricity applied to quack devices. You know, you'd have 2 little things attached to a dynamo, and supposedly you'd get some health benefit from these things. People were doing some really stupid stuff with electricity, but this was actually a good idea. So Edward Heburn in the US was actually doing time in jail for horse theft. So he had a bit of time on his hands, and he came up with this idea of a single rotor cipher machine. This one happens to be in the NSA Museum at Fort Meade. If you ever get an opportunity to go, I assure you it's really, really worthwhile. The National Cryptologic Museum folks are amazing humans, and they have a collection of stuff there, including an Enigma outside you can go and play with. And they tell the evolution of Heburn's machines, how they started with a single rotor machine, then went to 3, and eventually to a 5. There are very, very few surviving Heburns. It may interest you to know that there's another one in the Moscow Cryptographic Museum, which is a very, very good museum. Simultaneously in Sweden, Arvid Dam came up with an electric cipher machine, and that is the last known fragment of his technology, which is also at the NSA Museum at Fort Meade. And then Scherbius, the controversial Enigma machine. Now, his first machine was not based on electricity. His first machine, well, actually, there was a motor, but the difference is that this machine was based on printed output. Now, to give you an idea of the size of that machine, it was probably the volume of 2 times IBM's Selectric typewriter. So it's a big, chunky unit. And more specifically, Actually, I will go back to that slide. Everybody thought that Scherbius for a long time was the guy who invented it, but we found out in 2003 that's not actually correct. The first Enigma was actually conceived of by two Dutch sailors, but they were not permitted to commercialise their idea due to World War I. And then when they finally got the nod to be able to commercialise the idea at the end of hostilities, they found out that their patent had basically been stolen by the German, Scherbius. Very sad. But anyway, so Enigma went through multiple generations. The Handelsmaschine at the top, the very first generation, was this enormous, great, heavy, clunky thing. I don't think we'll ever find one. There were very few made. They were hideously unreliable due to the mechanical printing mechanism. It was replaced by the Schreibender Enigma, the second generation that you see there. Again, we're not aware in the collector community or the museum community of any surviving examples of that machine. Cosmetically, it looks very similar to a typewriter with a single rotor mounted on the right-hand side. Then we get to the Schreibender Enigma in the bottom left corner. Late 1920s technology, the last stab at trying to build a machine where printing is a central function. Now, one of those machines has been found in Argentina. It was one of a lot of 4 that were sold in the 20s to Argentina when it was a very rich country, not a fascist nightmare. Long before that. And another one turned up in Hungary about a dozen years ago. And that machine has subsequently disappeared from view. And nobody's quite sure where that one is. But I'm sure it hasn't been destroyed, but it's just probably decorating some general's office or something like that. And then finally, in parallel with that last Schreibender Enigma, the Glühlampen machine was being developed. And the Glühlampen machine, or glowing lamp machine, was designed to engineer out the complexity of printing and to be able to deliver a machine that was far more inherently reliable just with light bulb output. And that brings us to this point here. So we have today, for a bit of show and tell, a 1935 military pattern Enigma M1. And the giveaway is the Steckerbrett, or plug board, on the front panel. This was added in 1935 to greatly increase the key space of the commercial Enigma. The commercial Enigma, if you like, looked more like this, right? It had the keyboard, the lamp board, the rotors, but no Stecker at the front. So that's your 1935 addition to the machine. Let's do just a little bit of PowerPoint-based familiarisation. It's an electromechanical device, right? Through a combination of mechanical function, which drives the rotor movement, the rotor movement brings into play a series of rotors which have contacts on one side of each rotor and contacts around the circumference of the other side. And inside each rotor, and I'll hold one up here because I know we've got a big zoom camera. Inside each rotor is a whole mess of crazy wiring. And what that wiring does is it takes the spring-loaded contacts that are on one side and it maps them to a different contact or another letter on the other flat face. You'll also notice that on that rotor there's a notch at the bottom, and it's that notch that drives the odometer turnover of the rotors. Okay? Now, every time we press a key on the Enigma, say I press the letter O, I can press the letter O all day long, and the one thing that I will never get back out of the Enigma is the result of a letter O. And we'll get into more of that in a moment, but the reason essentially is that every letter through the crazy wiring inside the rotor is mapped to a different letter, and it is just an inherent part of the design of an Enigma that when the electrical path is going through the machine, eventually as it goes through the rotors, it hits a small component at the other end called a reflector. The reflector picks up that signal and turns it back through the rotors a second time. And because, say, the letter O enters down one path, you can't send the power back down the same path. So it can't return as an O, right? It's inherently just a design fact of any machine that has a reflector in it. So the way that Enigma works is at the back of the machine, we have a battery box. We have a more modern type of battery here. It can also be powered via a transformer. We need about 4.5 volts for the machine. So we have a power pack here. At the front, we have the plug board. the keyboard, the lamp board, which is where our result comes up. And you'll notice if I press a key, you can see it up there on the screen. There's a different lamp showing up each time I press the key. And then finally here we have the actual crypto engine of the machine. If I rotate that lever forward, push the reflector to the side, we can squeeze the rotors together and lift out the crypto engine of the machine, which is these 3 rotors. Each rotor has a number, 1 through 5, and each of those rotors is keyed differently internally through different wiring, right? Now, the key fact about that is if you force a German submarine to the surface and you capture the rotors, once you know the rotor wiring for one rotor, then you know the wiring for all the other rotors that are of the same sort, which is why it was so critical to actually capture Enigma machines as well as their documentation. Now, one interesting thing about the rotors is that not only are the contacts wired differently through each rotor, I mentioned also before this little notch that drives the rotational behaviour of the odometer, right? So every time I'm pressing a key, the rightmost wheel is turning over one spot. When that turns over 26, the next rotor turns over one slot. Inside this rotor, there is actually a little slip ring, and let's see if we can spot that. Yeah, we can. Okay, fantastic. So if I just put a nail in there, you can actually see how I can change the position of that notch relative to the circumference of the rotor. Can people see that? Yeah. And in doing so, I'm actually affecting the behaviour of the rotor turnover. And that's really awesome from the point of view of exploding the potential key space of the machine. Let's just drop those back into the machine. So you might ask, and you should, how do I then configure the machine for daily operation? There are 2 things here. We're following this sheet. Stabsmaschinenschlüssel, so the machine cipher number 28 for the Heer or the Army. And every day I go to my pre-shared key book. It was like an A5 book. And inside it I have this table. And there's actually some interesting instructions here that says, one says, don't ever take this thing on an aeroplane. There was far too much risk of planes being shot down, this material being captured. But across here, running from left to right, I have the day of the month, because I change this cipher at midnight every day. I then have what's called the Walzenlager, which is the rotor order. So I go to the 5 available rotors that I have, and I insert them into the machine in this order that is specified here. So today, I've just picked the 23rd of October, 1944. So we are configuring our machine accurately as it was, I think that was the beginning of the Battle of Leyte in the Coral Sea, which is a little bit irrelevant for, in the Philippines, but a little bit irrelevant for Europe, but you get the idea. So 23rd of October, 44. So we need rotor number 5, then rotor number 2, and then rotor number 4. And we adjust the slip ring positions to, what do we got? 1, 25, 2, etc. And then finally, we're given the positions for the Stecker plugs. Now, the Stecker plugs, every day the Germans remap 10 letters to 10 other letters. So for today, I can see that I have to map E to Y, D to T, K to F, M to D, and so on and so forth. Now, a really interesting thing from a cyber person's point of view, like our world is very dynamic, right? We can apply patches, we can quickly map things in applications, we can move very, very nimbly. But this machine is from the days of relay-driven computing, right? Really very, very basic, purpose-specific machines. And so if you think about, imagine that you captured this machine and you wanted to build an analog, right? Something that would emulate its behaviour, not necessarily look cosmetically identically the same, but do the same thing. You could only build that out of mechanical components and relays. And it is a gift to you, as the person who's trying to reverse engineer this machine, to know that for certain the Germans will use 10 cables and 10 cables only every single day. If the Germans had been given 12 cables and had been told you can use any arbitrary number of key remappings from 1 to 12, that would have been a complete nightmare to try and build an analog for that. But knowing that they used 10 every day allowed us to very quickly zero in on how we would build an analog. So we've set on this machine the rotor order, the Walzenlager, the Ringstellung, which is the slip ring position for the odometer, and the Steckerverbindung, which is the remappings of the keys here. And just for instance, I'm going to pick the most crap key in the world. We're going to go with 1, 2, 3. How about that? 1, 2, 3. So we've set up what I would regard as the underlying machine key. Everyone on our radio network who uses that book now has their machine's key to like. And what happens is when I press a key on the Enigma, you'll see the third row of key pressed there. When I press a key, the key presses down, it hits a kind of an effect you would think of as like a seesaw. As you push down at the front, the back lifts up and a hand reaches out, rotates the rotor, and what happens is the electric path flows through the machine, and if there is a cable in place for the letter E, what would have come back and lit up the letter E instead is rerouted to the letter Y. Similarly, when I put input into the machine, if I have E stecked to Y, when I press the letter E, the machine isn't thinking that I've pressed an E. The power flows out of the machine through the cable and it re-enters as a Y, right? So it's this function at the front, the Steckerverbindung, the replugging of the letters, that actually explodes the key space of the machine to 150 million, right? A very big number. So we have our machine set up with the underlying machine key for the day and with the cables in place. So how do we build our radio message prior to it actually being encrypted? Well, the first thing is, on the far right of this sheet, we have a date indicator. The date indicator is really important because if you got a message arrive at, say, 12:15 in the morning, your first question would be, wait a minute, was this enciphered with yesterday's settings, or is it the first message of today with our settings for what is it, Saturday? You don't really know. But to save you time figuring it out, they include a date indicator. So I take any two random letters that I think of, add them to the date indicator. That goes into the metadata header at the beginning of my message. I have obviously some body text that I will put on my Funkspruch form, which is my message form. And so I'll write that in clear text first. I will have my sender initials. I'll have Kawaiicon nominated as the receiver. I'll have the time of day that I'm sending the message. I'll have the number of characters, which is the date indicator plus my clear text. And you can kind of think of that as like a checksum. So when the person gets a message at the other end, they know they've got the right number of characters. And then we get to something really interesting and unexpected. The initial rotor starting position is actually included. And I remember when I first saw this, I thought, that's insane, right? How can that be included? But the Germans were so confident that the rest of the state of the machine was unknowable that it was actually okay to share this information. Really, really surprising. Now, I have a decrypt secret. And again, poor OPSEC, but just for the sake of argument, I'm going to use my decrypt secret as sub, and my clear text is submarines. Now, we don't share the decrypt secret. The decrypt secret is effectively a per message cipher. So we have an underlying machine setup, right? That is effectively the daily key, and all machines on the network are configured the same way. But also on a per message basis, I generate a key which is unique to that message. And this is why Bletchley needed the bomb machine. They needed to work out the per machine key. And so what I do is I now walk up to my machine that has all of the daily settings configured, and in my mind, I pick any three letters for the per message key. I'm just going to pick sub, and I enter SUB. S returns a W, U returns an A, and B returns another W. That's great, right? We want that kind of unpredictability in the letters. So what I've ended up with is WAW as the decrypt indicator. And that's what I send to my recipient, right? They don't get to see sub, they get to see WAW. But because their machine is configured identically to mine, they will now go to their daily settings and add the initial rotor position 1, 2, 3. And when they enter the decrypt key WAW, guess what they get out? They get sub. Now they know the decrypt key for the rest of the message. And so they now change the rotors of their machines to the letters for SUB, which is 19, hope this is making sense for folks. This is a kind of a pretty primitive way to be able to... So the rotors are now changed to match sub, right? 19, 21, and 2. And I encrypt the rest of my message using that 3-letter key, sub. I send SUB to the recipient. Sorry, I said WAW to the recipient. They turn that into sub. And what they get at the other end is they get all of this metadata. And by the way, I just want to pause on one important point. Even when folks in Australia at Central Bureau, people in the US Navy Waves or Bletchley Park, even when they captured great masses of these messages and they couldn't decrypt them, the metadata was still incredibly valuable. Such an interesting telling point for cyber today. Think about what this tells us. You know, we get to know who the senders are and their location. We can see them communicating with high command or between themselves. The more they're communicating between themselves, the more that we know there's an action coming. We can see the time of day. There are all sorts of things that betray opponent behaviour in the metadata. And that became a whole science in itself. And there was a guy you don't hear a lot about at Bletchley called Irving John Good. And Irving John Good ran the statistical operations there, including a lot of the Hollerith machine functions, the punch card-based systems. So the people at the other end receive this, DDJQN, TQTOQ. They use the decrypt indicator to return SUB. They set their machines to 192102 to match sub. And when they run those letters through the machines, it'll give them back the clear text submarines. Awesome. That's how it's done, right? And so if you think about the bomb machine, if you've seen photos of it, it's basically a great big machine about 7 feet wide, 6, 7 feet high, and it's essentially 36 analogues of the rotors of an Enigma queued up in series, and they would create a menu for that machine and run the machine, and the machine was hunting for all of the possibilities that could be the rotor settings for that particular message, right? Very, very interesting, for the daily settings. So a very, very interesting electromechanical approach to compute. Now you can come and touch this machine downstairs. I have all of these machines set up in a capture the flag, right? The capture the flag, you take the German messages that come in over the radio, same as they would have in World War II or the Cold War in this case, record those down, run them through a one-time pad. That gives you 2 phrases. The first one is then entered as the decrypt key on the second set of machines, and the second phrase is ciphertext that you enter in, and then the machine does the second stage decrypt for you. It's an awesome recreation of a Cold War methodology. Now I have a volunteer somewhere here backstage. Where are you, Philip? Everyone give Philip a hand. Now, we're just going to very quickly look at this second machine. So we had a good look at the rotor of the German Enigma. I'm just going to pause very slightly and show you the rotor of this second machine as we start to talk about lessons learned from the Enigma. Now, this second machine is called a Neue Maschine. It was developed in Switzerland. The Swiss were buying these Enigma machines from the Germans just before World War II. Not the military version with the Stecker, that was restricted for the German military, but the commercial version they were buying with an extra lamp panel so an officer could be seeing the results from the machine at the same time. And to their horror, they found out very early in World War II, not only were the Germans reading their Enigma traffic, right, but the Allies were as well. Interesting lesson learned there. They realised that the only way that they could have safe communications was to take everything that they had learned from Enigma and build their own machine within the borders of Switzerland that only they knew and controlled. They built exactly 640 of these machines, and the reason they're in such good condition is they were deployed down nuclear bunkers in the 1940s, and they sat there for 40 years waiting for the go code, which, thank Christ, never came. So, the genius of the Swiss rotor design, if I can get a bit of a close-up, I'll move over here, is that the Swiss rotor actually comes apart in 2 sections. And it spins on its axis like so. The right-hand side, this is the functional equivalent of the Enigma rotor. The contacts on one side are mapped to different letters on the other side. And here we have the other piece that snaps onto it. And on here we can see that there are multiple lands and grooves, and each one of those lands and grooves is actually the trigger for a rotor rollover, right? Multiple. And you see the genius of it is, because I can mix and match the letter switching and the rotor rollover behaviour, I get enormous variability in the behaviour of the machine. In other words, generate a huge key space, in actual fact larger than Enigma, but with a mechanically simpler implementation. There's no plug board, right? It's all done through the rotor action, which is genius. So good on you, Swiss people. Let's move over here to this machine. So you can see that cosmetically, it's very, very similar. We have the same sort of architecture. We have the keyboard at the front, we have the lamp board for the result at the behind, but look at the number of rotors, right? There are more rotors on this machine because we have 4 rotors from an available 6 that are packed into the chassis, plus they spin on that axis, so it looks like there's 10 rotors. In fact, the red one is the entry rotor for the system. The one on the far right is the reflector, and there are 4 pairs in between made up of those slip rings, right? A very, very nice machine. There are some other improvements on Enigma as well, where the Enigma uses a flat light globe, which is specific to that machine. This one uses general torch lamps, which, let me tell you, makes my life easier in terms of maintenance. It can also be run off battery, transformer, or even a mains plug, which, you know, no way am I brave enough to use that, but you get the idea. It even comes in with what were brilliant innovations for the day. There were few houses that had plenty of power points, so you could screw this into a lamp in a ceiling, and it actually hands over to 2 power points, which is kind of neat. All comes packed into one case. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do an interesting little kind of 2-machine demo of Enigma in action. So Philip, come over here. We're going to use the same keyword that we used before, the same clear text, submarines, and I've keyed the 2 machines alike, and where the key is set on this machine, if we can zoom in again with that overhead camera, is on the bottom row of the machine across here. We've got the word Wellington set up. And, I've just realised I've got, Wellington, 10 letters. So I've got Wellington set up on both machines. And what I want you to do, if you can just stand off to the side a little so people can see through the camera, I want you to type in submarines 1 letter at a time, and I'm going to record the cipher text. So hit me. So we've got so submarines becomes A, yep, I, Q, Q again, that's good, yep, M, T, O, Y, X, D, A, I, Q, Q, M, T, O, Y, X, D. If that's not a winning hand at Scrabble, I don't know what is. Now, the fabulous thing here is that both the M and the B both returned a Q together. And that's the result we want, right? We don't actually have the ability to turn a Q into a Q. That would be even better. Subsequent generations of machines could do that sort of stuff, but these can't. But it's that sort of complexity in the result which is highly desirable. We're going to switch sides now, and I'm going to call out the cipher text, and we're going to return the clear text on the panel here. Now, the thing about Enigma is it's a reciprocal system, right? It's electrically wired through. So if an E returns a Y, then a Y must return an E, right? And this is one of the essential facts of how the bomb operates, the decrypt machine as well. So I'm going to call them out, and you type them in, and we will see the result coming up both on this flat panel here, the officers panel, as well as on the machine. So A gives us an S, I returns the U, Q gives us a B, Q again, M, letter M gives us an A, letter T, returns an R, letter O, returns an I, letter Y. German keyboard, mate, well done. Gives us an N, X, gives us our E, and D. Thank you. So this is fabulous, right? You can see very quickly how, someone who's typing faster than us, it's inherently a two-operator machine, right? One person is doing the typing, the other person is madly writing out the results from the lamp board, and then they prep that and out it goes. Now, it would typically go out via radio. It could go out via teleprinter. The Germans had the Hellschreiber machine, which folded up into a Panzerholz case like this one, into a metal transport case. It could also go out via, amazingly enough, pigeon, right, in a message tube on a pigeon leg. That was less common for the Germans in World War II, but it was still used. Or it could go out via, say, a motorcycle courier. Very, very common. What they didn't like doing was they didn't like sending original crypt material, right, key material via aircraft, but they were happy to send it via land. I did mention before another lesson learned from Enigma. These machines are not capable of enciphering a letter as itself. However, in the US, they developed the KL7 machine in the 50s, and the Russians invented the Fialka machine. We have a very nice Fialka in our collection. And the Fialka has an extra button on the side of it. It looks rather different. It's kind of this classic, clunky, hammer-tone paint, Soviet engineering, heavy as hell chassis, but it has an extra button at the side. And when the first Fialkas were found by collectors about 15, 20 years ago, some bright sparks in the Netherlands did a complete teardown of the machine, and they realised that what that switch was, it drove a function called re-injection. And what re-injection does is, inside these machines, as I'm returning a result to the lamp board, that's the output, what a re-injection circuit does is it intercepts that output and it feeds it back into the crypto engine to drive the rotors a second time, right? So I'm pressing an E, and I would have got an L, but now I can pick up that L, send it back through the crypto engine, and sometimes I'll get an E. So an E can become an E. That overcomes the rotor limitation. So even though Fialka and KL7 are rotor-driven machines, they get away from that problem where you've got a little tiny crib in the system in that you can look for the rejection mask that says, well, it can't be an E because I've got an E in the result. Very neat solution. And finally, we move through the Cold War. And again, you can do this very nice Cold War exercise downstairs afterwards. We move away from really trusting people with key material at all. Wherever possible, we want to engineer out the chance that a human can have the key material and mishandle it. And we also want to find better ways to communicate in secret to illegal agents overseas. And for that, we use the number station generator with a one-time pad. So as an illegal agent, I will turn up to a dead drop, some other designated place, and a little tiny booklet will be waiting for me, perhaps sticky taped under a bridge. And that should be the last time that I have any kind of physical contact with my handler. I take that one-time pad back home, and I know that at a designated time every week I'm listening on shortwave radio to a given frequency. Ideal if it's a digital radio, I can just quickly program in that frequency, I can sit there and listen. And what I'm listening for is this. 93 is my handler. My agent number. Okay, we can bring the audio down on that. We're going to do a hard boot on that. So the point is this. What the number station does, feeding the machine in the back end, is an encrypted number stream that comes in via serial, or I can feed it via a punch tape, or alternatively program it via the front panel. For the sake of portability, I just program this thing via the front panel, right? And I'm programming it with one side of a one-time, with a message encrypted via a one-time pad. Nobody sees that, nobody touches that key material. It's completely automated through to the Stasi box in the front end. It goes out over the airwaves to an agent of, in this case, Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, right, foreign reconnaissance intelligence in the West. They receive that message and they're writing down the 4 number groups. Each 4 number group is repeated to give you 2 chances at writing it down. They decrypt that message. They immediately burn that page of the one-time pad. It's never reused, and they detune the radio. And at that point, there's no proof that that communication ever happened. You can tell who's transmitting, but you can't tell who's listening to a shortwave reception. And that gets us away from a lot of the problems that have to do with key handling. Now, also in the collection, we've got a couple of things called key fill devices. And a key fill device, rather than giving people a physical hard copy book which can be seized, the key fill device electronically holds a whole lot of keys with a selector switch. So I can put in, say, key 1, 2, 3, 4 or whatever. I can load them into military radios and phone systems and such. And under duress, I can just press a couple of buttons and I can destroy the contents of the key fill, right? So that the keys aren't compromised. At the back end, it was fairly common in these days to have what was called a key tape destruction machine, and when you're finished with your punch key tapes, you simply feed them into the machine, and it doesn't just shred them, it literally turns them to powder. And I think that gives us a pretty good summary of how we got to Enigma, its significance, how it was configured, and its impact on subsequent generations of crypt gear. And with that, I'm within time, which is great, and I thank you very much.